Welcome to this research seminars series. Today, we have two presenters, Dr. Sunil Kumar and Rifan Rahim. Rifan is over there. Welcome, Rifan.
Thank you so much.
The presentation is titled Segregation by the Dispossession of Aspirations, Young Muslim Professionals and the Politics of Othering in Rental Housing Markets, New Delhi, India. A brief introduction to both presenters. Of course, requires no introduction, but nonetheless, I will introduce him. Sunil Kumar convenes the MSc International Social and Public Policy Development degree, as well as the elective Urbanization and Social Policy in Global South for undergraduates and postgraduates in the department. He has researched housing since 1982 and gained his PhD from University College London on low-income landlords in Madras, India. He went on to research low-income landlords in the cities of Bangalore and Surat, a study funded by the then UK Department of International Development entitled Social Relations, Rental Housing Markets, and the Poor in Urban India. He went on to research with Melissa Fernandez the urbanization, construction, migration nexus in 5 cities in South Asia: Kabul, Dhaka, Chennai, Kathmandu, and Lahore. Research also funded by the FID. He returns to housing after a hiatus of 25 years and now researches the anti-Muslim othering in the rental housing markets of New Delhi, India, together with Rifan Rahim. Rifan is a development practitioner from Kerala, India. Rifan has a BA honors in political science, philosophy and economics, and MA in urban policy and governance from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, India, which has a fantastic campus, of course. Rifan's MA thesis was entitled Male Migration, Gulf Remittance, and its Socioeconomic Impact on the Lives of Stay-Behind Wives in Calicut, Kerala. Rifan's research interests sit at the intersection of social justice and the urban, engaging with how cities shape and are shaped by questions of identity, power, and belonging. Rifan is interested in the intersection of housing with segregation, as well as everyday exclusion, especially in the lived experiences of marginalized communities in India. Great. So, welcome, both of you, for presentation. And I mean, Sunil is here, of course, but nonetheless, welcome you. And over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan. Thanks, Hakan, for taking the time to chair.
Yes, nice.
I'm also pleased that Hamza is here. Hamza made contact with me a few weeks ago. He's a PhD student in the economics department, also researching segregation in housing. So
welcome, Hamza.
I thought it's a good. And I just want to say how we started this project. So the origins of this research is a very joint project. It didn't come from my idea. It came from a joint idea. First, Rifan contacted me about the MSc ISPP development. We wanted to know what the course is about, how to apply. And then we started talking about her postgraduate degree and her housing, especially her lived housing experience and discrimination in both Mumbai and Delhi. And this discussion then led us to an inquiry into discrimination, othering of Muslims in urban rental housing markets in Delhi. Rifan was working in Delhi at that time, so we chose Delhi as our case. And as I said, mentioned, this is a return to my work in housing some 15 years since I last wrote about housing issues. So the idea here is to say that this originated from a joint discussion rather than it coming from me. There is very little background research on rental housing and discrimination. And most of that research is to do with the material aspects, the condition of housing, the rent, the amenities, and so on and so forth. And the only kind of large piece of work available to us then when we researched the literature was this work by Mishra from 2020, doing a telephonic kind of survey of house owners and tenants in Delhi. So they did a telephonic audit, they did a house visit audit, a broker's audit, and a tenant's interview. And this shows very clearly the kind of number of people that they covered in these in these audits, both upper caste i.e. Brahmins, and then the scheduled castes, which SC scheduled caste, which links up to the Dalits, Muslims, and then Northeast migrants, especially Assam, which is 68% Muslim, is also got this anti-Muslim feeling. So these three groups are the groups that are kind of excluded. And one thing that Rifan mentioned, which I think was interesting, is while Dalits, the scheduled castes and Muslims live in these kind of very congested places, the kind of violence meted out to Muslims in the built environment through demolitions, and the demolitions largely by yellow JCB bulldozers. And then we saw that those pictures of the bulldozers being used in New York with the Hindu diaspora, the right-wing Hindu diaspora there. So this gives you a base idea. And this percentages of house owners ready to give house to these three categories is 58%. So Hindus do give out their houses, they rent out their houses to other groups, but we will see how this works. And there are two other categories here, the one around direct refusal and refused indirectly. This is very clearly, direct refusal now is to say, I'm not going to rent out accommodation to you because you're Muslim. There's no hiding of that fact. Indirect is like, oh, we are vegetarian and so on and so forth as kind of important. Okay? But ready to give is still a sizable proportion. But yet, there is no understanding of the kind of the demeaning status attached to Muslims when they look for rental housing. And I'll mention this a little later, but when I shared this information about this project with Greta and shared a paper that you have written about race and how that was also experienced. So this is roughly that kind of learning. So it's all coming together in a very different way. And certain conditions, again, this is putting conditions on Muslims that won't be otherwise applied to other people. Yeah. And again, this looks at three localities, high income, middle income, and low income. And on the left-hand column, you'll see the upper caste is really around 92% willingness to actually rent. But with the scheduled castes and the Muslims and the Northeast migrants, there's less acceptance in the high-income locality and much more in the low-income locality. So there's a caste and a class kind of issue as well. Now, this slide just shows how discrimination behavior by house owner for Muslims is very high, 53% experience that, and 35% discrimination behavior by brokers. Let's not forget that brokers is the way in which you can access housing, and brokers then also act as gatekeepers to that whole process. And here, the nature of response by a house owner, behavioral changes. And I think this is something that I could not actually identify, because I'm not Muslim, although I look Muslim with my cap and my beard. And people say to me, Salaam alaikum, and I know I should say Assalam. It doesn't come automatically because I'm not Muslim. But behavioral changes, and Rifan will talk about that, about how when you suddenly speak to people and they realize you're Muslim, their behavior changes. And it's very, very subtle. Direct denial, putting conditions, already rented out, giving excuse, indirectly denied, and so on and so forth. And here's reasons for denial: lower paying capacity. Now, this doesn't apply to our sample because these are young professional Muslims with the ability to pay. But social group identity, and you can see the Muslim 69% because of social group identity. Hygiene and cleanliness is another thing attached to the Muslim trope. That's 35%. Food habits, 62%. Prefer good people. And this is like as if Muslims are not good people. This is kind of idea that you prefer good people, and the objection of neighbors. And this is also very important. It's about how you're located in a kind of habitus, if you like, of that portion. And here, consequences for the Muslims have to vacate very quickly, do not get suitable to income. This is what we are putting on the dispossession of aspirations. Do not get suitable quality of housing, and compromise with the quality of services, very, very high for Muslims. So, and Dr. Lawrence comes to my mind is, where's your research question? So put your research question there. How do young professional Muslims experience discrimination and othering in Delhi's rental housing market? So the emphasis here is really around the psychosocial dimension. It's about how do they feel. And in one of the conversations I was having with Rifan, where Rifan said that I become immune to it. And I asked Rifan that, doesn't it still hurt? And Rifan, what did you tell me when I asked you that?
It hurts, but I mean, it's also a survival tactic that you have. You have to get your house. So if one rejects, you get immune to it. Go to the next one because it's shelter at the end of the day. So
So that is how we looked at it. And we focused on young professional Muslims, which emanates from three things. First is the social positioning of Muslims in India. Extensive committee was set up in 2006 to investigate the conditions of Muslims, called the Sachar Committee, which shows that Muslims on average are deprived in many areas: education, housing, employment, and so on and so forth. The second one is assumptions of this mismatch between aspirations and affordability. And people say you can aspire to want to live in these areas, but you can't afford it. But these people can. They show that they can. And largely these are single people, so they share accommodation, not just like students here who share accommodation. So this kind of attitude from the outside about the mismatch of aspirations with affordability. And the third one is an assumption about aspirations versus neighborhood religious makeup. Now, these Muslims are not seeking to live in Hindu areas. Delhi is predominantly Hindu. But the upward social mobility areas happen to be where Hindus live, right? So that is where a lot of the discrimination happens, in a kind of pushing people out from that. So what we did in terms of research methods, and that's why Rifan is here on the Zoom call with me, is we had general observations and interviews with both long-term residents and civil society organizations in the area that we were studying. That's the first thing we did. The second, we had interview with Muslim tenants to understand how they experience discrimination and othering. We then had interviews with Hindu landlords who rented out to Muslim tenants. And this is where our research sits in a kind of fuzzy area, because there is the hatred of Muslims. On the other hand, the Hindu landlords are renting out to Muslims, right? And it seems there's a bifurcation there about the instrumental value of rental housing, i.e. rent, regular tenants, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, very anti-Muslim sentiments, and Rifan will talk about this a little bit later. And the autoethnography, and we are combining qualitative interviews with autoethnography. And often autoethnography is simply read in text. I thought I'll bring in Rifan here as a live autoethnography, where we can speak about some of the kind of discrimination she has faced as a young Muslim person. Right? So that's how we are progressing this notion. And we had a total of 32 interlocutors, 23 male and 9 female in these different categories. Rough map of Muslim populations, second largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia. 40% of all Muslims live in urban areas, so highly urbanized. Upper caste Hindus are slightly more urbanized than that. Around 200 million people out of 1.4 billion. Right? So it's still a minority, but a sizable minority. But the fear that is mongered by the current BJP government is that Muslims are a rapidly expanding population and they're going to take over the country. Again, these two places are important. The top one is Kashmir, and the right is the northeastern states where the discrimination of migrants live. Just to give those an idea of where this is located, students from India will know this. The site is Delhi, Jamia Nagar, particular highly occupied by Muslims, predominantly Muslims. And I come from Chennai in the south of India, and Rifan comes from Kozhikode in Calicut. Rifan is going to say something about reflexivity because of her, she being a Muslim and a young female. So Rifan, up to you.
yeah. So obviously my personality and subjectivity as a Muslim woman really did fundamentally shape both the process of the fieldwork itself and the nature of insights that emerged from it. like Dr. Kumar mentioned, we did not have like an homogeneous group of interlocutors. We had Hindu landlords, we had Okla long-term residents, we had Muslim tenants, and their own relationship with the research question was very differed. And so to navigate it, it was quite complex, especially with the Hindu landlords, because I was entering these conversations to understand discrimination against Muslims while also speaking to those who, in many cases, actively practice it. And this had a lot of modulation in language tone because I had to make sure that I do not frame questions in a way that they get any sense of accusation. And there was a constant trial I have to do so that I appear as a neutral researcher and not someone who has a stake in it. And at the same time, it was very interesting to speak to these Hindu landlords because on an individual level, they were extremely accommodative of me, but had absolutely no reservations in expressing their own extremely Islamophobic views. Our second interlocutors, of course, the Okla long residents, was in fact the most inaccessible or difficult to get through because under the current regime, everyone is very scared to speak openly, especially since they are surveilled all the time. And to get my personality did not work much there, even though I belong to the same community. In most cases, if not all, there needed to be an intermediary or a network that they trust, and that is only how I got to them. And in a lot of times, in fact, an interview, we decide on an interview, a schedule, I'd go to Jamia Nagar and no one would show up. And you can obviously not blame them because I myself know how it is to speak of these things openly. In fact, the easiest and the most accessible was Muslim women and also the young professional Muslims. And this is where my identity really happened to, acted as a bridge to get to them. And they were quite open in speaking to me and then also in going into the depths of the conversation as well. And in fact, a lot of times, so to get to Jamia Nagar, I had to take a cab because I lived in South Delhi and it's towards the end of it, 20 minutes ride. But unfortunately, by the time I get to Jamia Nagar, the cab drivers would be like, we can't go any further because it's a strange community. And because you can't see the visible identity markers on me. Sometimes they don't categorize myself as a Muslim and then they would speak all of these to me. So I feel like in a lot of ways, the process of the fieldwork itself extended beyond interview because it required inhabiting and therefore also experiencing the very perceptions of the research we sought to examine.
Thank you. The key points there was this notion of visibly Muslim. What is being visibly Muslim? And for women, it's covering the hair and it's the hijab and the burqa. And for men, it's the skull cap and the beard. If there's no skull cap, the beard is kind of identified as Muslims. And a couple of things that Rifan mentioned, and we talk about this later, is about how Muslims are forced to hide their identity when they're not so-called visibly Muslim. Okay, so this is our location in the southeast of Delhi. This is the Okla constituency, assembly constituency, within which Jamia Nagar is a mix of what they call colonies or neighborhoods in India. And that gives you a much broader picture. The shaded area is the constituency which we focused on, and the entire block is the national constituency. And here I think it's important because one thing to understand is that when we're doing the research in India, people talk with very understandably Indian perceptions of places and names. They don't say it's in Southeast Delhi, they'll just say the name of the place, right? And you have to infer from that. So if you're presenting this to an audience who doesn't know India, those kind of places become quite difficult. And I'll say this because in the actual interviews, and we got quotations from that, which we will look at, they mention these names, and it's important to understand where they come from. The first is Jamia Millia Islamia University. It's a Muslim minority university established right in the 1930s, and then moved to this location post-independence from Uttar Pradesh. And this Jamia then gives its name to the whole cluster of neighborhoods. So it's very, very difficult. You can't say, oh, which borough are you in? No, it's just Jamia Nagar. And then it's a particular place. And if you say, oh, it doesn't fall within that kind of boundaries is, yeah, still Jamia Nagar. So that is the idea around that. It's very important. The second thing to keep important is this idea of Bartla House. Bartla House comes up in the interviews a lot. And this was the kind of space for a police encounter in 2008. And police encounters in India, which extend towards the Maoist and extends towards the other forms of insurgency, are actually extrajudicial killings. Right? So when you say encounter, Indians know what it means. Right? Other people say, but encounter, don't you encounter people? You know, it's a different kind of encounter. And of course, the story behind this is that they belonged to a particular Islamic group. They were students, they were terrorists, and the police went in, and 2 of them were shot and 1 was captured. And of course, good old Bollywood 10 years later produces a film which then actually makes this into fact, right? It takes that whole thing through Bartla House as the film. But when people refer to Bartla House in terms of how the area is understood, in terms of security, in terms of surveillance, in terms of anti-Muslimness, this comes up a lot in the discussion. Bartla House. Okay. So you might say, I'm from Jamia Nagar, and say, Bartla House. Everything then gets reduced to Bartla House. And then the third important bit is Shaheen Bagh. And Shaheen Bagh was the site of the 2019 protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens. And this was really aimed at so-called providing safe haven for minority Hindus from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, but then got extended into the Northeast, into Assam and so on and so forth, to deny non-Hindus citizenship rights. And the Indian Constitution doesn't do that. So that is a very important marker as well for this whole idea of the othering of Muslims. Okay? Now, the most recent book, 2012, by Laurent Geyer and Christopher Jeffrelot. Christopher Jeffrelot does a lot of work on Indian politics, especially on Muslims. And I just thought these 2 covers are interesting. The one on the left is the cover from HarperCollins, India. And there are 3 Muslims sitting next to some kind of Hindu deity. Yeah, that is very, very clear. Then it shows this kind of secular nature of the country. Muslims in Indian cities is Hearst Publications, UK, removed completely that linkage to any kind of Hindu identity and only has Muslims on the cover. And I think in the background is the shape of a boat, maybe shipbreaking. So what they argue in that book, and basically they're trying to create, if you like, an analytical framework to understand these majority Muslim areas as whether they are ghettos or not. And they're looking at this idea of how incidents of violence have sustained dynamics of self-segregation. This is the idea that you move towards a certain area because of violence, and how this process of socioeconomic marginalization has affected Muslims. And fearing for their security, Muslims are increasingly living in ghettos across the country. That's the Sachar Committee, a government committee that also uses the word ghettos. And finally, Geyer and Jeffrelot say, if this discussion on ghettoization is fast becoming part of the common sense of Hindu-Muslim relations in contemporary India, it deserves to be examined carefully as to construct the Muslim ghetto as an analytical tool rather than a folk concept. So this draws on Louis Wachman's work, and it draws on Peter Marcuse's work on looking at whether these are slums or citadels or enclaves or ghettos. Now, we're not looking at that. We're not looking at how we term these places. But what we're saying is that these are predominantly Muslim areas, and therefore, whether people are forced to actually congregate there, that's one thing, and then we look at class as well, or are people seeking to exit from it, but can't, right? So therefore, we're looking at how segregation is resulting from a lack of an escape, rather than being simply forced into that place. So that's what, so the folk concept is important because that reference is coming from outside, the media, the Sachar report, and others. But I think it's very important for us to understand how Muslims themselves feel. And this is something we do talk about. I might mention it here. And I spoke to Rifan about this. Is do they, amongst themselves in Jamia Nagar, refer to it as a ghetto? Or do they refer to outsiders as a ghetto? Right? And Rifan said that the only way they can bring Muslimness and deprivation in the urban space together is to use the term ghetto. So there are Hindus and there are Sikhs and there are Christians living in areas that are poorly serviced. We don't call them Dalit ghettos or Christian ghettos or Hindu ghettos. We call them something else. So the idea of the ghettoization also links up to this idea of religion. And then religion then becomes in some way also race. It becomes this inferior, other, outsider, not part of India. All Muslims were previously Hindus and then got converted. So the kind of the work of the BJP government, the right-wing government, is to reconvert them back into Hindus. Because you can't become a Hindu. You have to be a Hindu by birth. So these are people who were Hindus by birth. That's the kind of wider public narrative that's being used. Then Suze Rind, who's at King's College London, picks up these 11 cities and does some kind of innovative methodology. And I've given the paper there. You can always look up the methodology in this. But one thing they did was they said, okay, if we use publicly available data, which is the electoral list, and the electoral list per electoral booth would have something like 1,500 people, right? And you'll have the names of the people. But it will not say Hindu, Muslim, Christian. So they used an algorithm to separate the Muslim sounding names from the Hindu names in order to understand densities. And this is what they produce. So you can see on the left, Delhi is highly segregated. The east is where the Muslims live. And in Kozhikode, where Rifan is from, it's not highly segregated. That's much more distributed. So just to give you an example of where things stand there. And this is Jamia Nagar. Okay. Very congested. You can see how it looks. You can't smell it or you can't hear it, but that's the. Yeah, we were trying to see if we could get a small video clip, but we couldn't do that this time. But very, very congested. And you can see there in the blue signboard, there is Amanatullah Khan, who's the MLA for this place. So he's a Muslim MLA. And when people talk about the area being poorly serviced, they forget that the MLA is also a Muslim MLA. But he's also spent time in jail because he was dealing with Waqf land issues and so on and so forth. So we have to put that into context. But I also kind of come back a little bit later saying why this idea of simply talking about the absence of the state is also problematic, given the nature of urbanism in Delhi. Just a point about in-house versus absentee landlords. In-house landlords, I mean, all landlords have kind of tenant relations secured. So you ask for references to make sure the person's got good character and they can pay the rent on time. But then religion normally doesn't come into play, but in India it does. And then you have in-house landlords who live in the house, and they are more likely, if they don't want Muslims to stay with them, really and acceptably focus on the idea of food. So if they're vegetarian, they don't want people consuming non-vegetarian food to be in the same house. And I think that's quite understandable throughout. But when it's used as an excuse to refuse Muslims, that's when it becomes slightly problematic. And then you have absentee landlords. I remember part of your presentation, when I asked the question about rental housing, and you said in the Mi Casa Mi Vida program in Brazil that you could only let out the house, the apartment, if you were not living there, because there was no real possibility of people doing that. So that very much is part of that process. And I thought this idea of this hatred against Muslims, it's not only hatred, really. Because hatred is what we find in the communal violence. Yeah? Here it's much more a dislike and a distrust of the Muslim population. So it's not hate, but it's a kind of dislike that comes in here. And how this trope of Muslims being unhygienic then it's put aside when you let your house to a Muslim. That is the contradiction that really is very difficult to explain. Okay, and in both cases, anti-Muslim sentiments persist, and this became emboldened after the Bharatiya Janata Party, the main Hindu fundamentalist party, came to power in India in 2014. Although in the third election cycle they lost their majority, but they're still in power. And this not wanting to hide the anti-Muslim sentiment kind of disappears. People become emboldened and say, no, you're Muslim, therefore you're out. So that's the research question. Back again, how do young professional Muslims experience discrimination given now the context within which we are sitting? And we have these analyses of these transcripts together with Rifan's ethnography, which produces three themes that we picked up. One is the segregation by the dispossession of aspirations, is one. The second one is the scrutiny and surveillance of the Muslim identity itself. And the third is spatial temporalities, outsider imaginations versus insider understandings. How outsiders perceive Jamia Nagar and how Jamia Nagar residents themselves perceive that space. Okay. And none of these three themes were predetermined. They came up from the interviews. And the idea of dispossession comes from David Harvey, accumulation by dispossession. It comes from Vijay Bhaskar in South India, talking about accumulation by neglect, how the neglect of agriculture, land, especially in irrigation, then pushes it into urban commercial use. And the third is Ghazala Jamil's study in Jamia Nagar called accumulation by segregation. How, while people are being forced to live in Jamia Nagar, then creates a space for capital accumulation by building of housing for rent by Muslims. Yes? So it's very important to understand that Muslims are not acting in any kind of philanthropic idea in this stage. Okay. But in these three instances, the focus is on the built environment and capital accumulation. And what instead we are focusing on is the kind of capabilities and functioning. So these Muslims have the capability, they're not deprived in terms of education or employment or any income. They are dispossessed from the actual renting out elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And the affective words, what does it mean to have a loss of dignity? Loss of dignity in some of the Indian sociological work, and drawing from the Western canon as well, talks about the idea of humiliation. Mm-hmm. And if you're humiliated, then you lose dignity, because dignity itself is not something you can study clearly on its own. So I think this is very important for us to understand. And again, this is why I said it resonates with the Corrector's paper on the pains of racism. And it's a kind of pain, it's a kind of how you feel like a second-class citizen and not included and so on. Now we have to understand the broad brushstrokes of Muslim violence in India, because this is located within that. Starts with partition in 47, some 20 million people displaced, large numbers killed on both sides, Hindus and Muslims. So violence is both sides, not just Hindus against Muslims. But the large narrative in India is that the violence was meted out to Hindus by Muslims, and the other side is completely covered. Then you have the Gujarat riots in 69. Then you have the Babri Masjid demolition. This is the idea that this mosque was built just a couple of hundred years old, several hundred years old, was built on the site of a Hindu temple belonging to the Lord Ram. So it was demolished as part of the right-wing Hindu party, and that caused a lot of riots and killing and violence. Then you had the 2002 Gujarat riots, followed by the Mumbai riots related to those days. Then you have riots in 2013, and finally in 2020, the Citizenship Amendment Act. Just before COVID, there were riots because of the anti-Muslim sentiment. Right? So this provides a kind of environment for anti-Muslim sentiments to persist, and of course the BJP government has kind of almost subcontracted dealing with Muslims through vigilante groups. So vigilante groups, which are non-state actors but tolerated by the state, working in this space. And this is also linked to the idea of beef consumption, because the cow is the sacred animal in Hinduism. This is not to say that Hindus don't consume beef. Right? They do. I had in university Brahmin friends who could strip a chicken thigh with a knife and fork, which I couldn't do myself. Very adept at doing that. So the anti-Muslim sentiments at the political level then starts going into the interpersonal level, especially in relation to housing. Here we have some in blue, some of these interlocutors' words expressed here. My husband said this is about how the dispossession of aspiration works. And it's very, very subtle, and it's very kind of intermingled. It's not kind of something you can see, kind of categorize as a separate box. My husband said we should live in a better area. And I think that's a basic right. It's about dignity and the right to live in a good home. But this right is denied to us just because of our identity. We are deprived of access to clean air, good water, and basic comfort. Now, this access to clean air, good water is never ever related to the fact that a Muslim MLA was part of this area. Okay? When you don't know what all is possible, if you're not exposed to the outside, how will you aspire? That's the most important thing. They don't meet people, so they don't know the kinds of wonders they can do with their lives. This is a lack of connection with other communities. I never wanted my family to stay here. I wanted to live in a society being a neighborhood, is another very Indian term, where it's easy to take out a car, where there's very little open air. Where there's little open air, over time, I've learned to live with the place that I'm in. They said, okay, if people say to you, yeah, your community is here, your Muslim food is here, why would you want to leave? And they said, but that's not the point. It's also a feeling of being trapped. Right? And if I want to leave, I can't leave. We don't have any control. The way we're studying now, the whole issue around education and aspirations are linked. The way we're exploring other parts of Delhi, looking at how other people live, we can live that way, but we are not allowed to do so. And we forget that we once thought we deserved better, and then you just move on. What can you do? So this idea of giving up is so much part of what our interlocutors say. That because they have been refused many times, or they know people who've been refused, they then would give up even looking for a way out from here. Why do we study? This is the whole idea. To improve our lives, right? And living well includes where you live. If you can't even choose where to live, are you truly an equal citizen? So the idea of citizenship and second-class citizenship comes up here. Because the government narrative has always said, you should have left for Pakistan in 1947. All of you, right? And the fact that you stayed here, then you lost your kind of citizenship rights by being here. That's the kind of public narrative that's being produced. And that idea of self-disciplining or self-hate begins to grow in me, not just in me, but also in my friends. It was like the city will not accept us if we're living in this area. So if people say, I'm living in Jamia Nagar, immediately the response is, mini Pakistan. Okay? That's the idea that is there. Or terrorist, that these are the kind of words that are used when you refer. I mean, you would know that they've been from Delhi as well. Yeah? We are not acceptable to the city. Even when I had enough money to move to a so-called better area, I didn't have the courage to face the discrimination I know I'll encounter. And this is another quote from that. Okay. Now, then there's this idea that the larger population in Delhi, meaning mostly Hindu, would like to take the product. So they come to Jamia Nagar to enjoy what they call Muslim cuisine. Right? It's the same area that they're so anti, they will go for the biryani and then go for the other kind of Muslim piece. And that disconnection between that being in a Muslim area and the food is something also is very difficult to explain. But I also feel that now with online deliveries, you can order the food from there without actually going there. So that degree of separation gets reinforced, right? They have no real access, no legacy, no ownership. And sometimes so this idea that we are reduced to ghazals, that is the Muslim kind of poetry and music, and biryani is something that is felt by our interlocutors. Rifan, are you coming in here?
No, I'm not coming in here. Mine would be on surveillance.
Okay, so then the question is asked, what do the Hindu landlords gain by refusing things to Muslims? One is this kind of notion of dislike, but I think there's also the link that one can make to this Du Bois's idea of psychological. Somehow feel empowered in that refusal, even though your position has not changed. And we've seen what's happened in India since 2014, jobless growth and so on and so forth. There is no kind of way in which life is improved, but you have this freedom to discriminate against another group, right? So the power to refuse, I think, is important. Showcasing to neighbors. This is also important because in India, the whole idea around that kind of social capital is very, very important. Right? So this Rifan will also speak to when she speaks about her experience with her own landlady. And this denial emboldened, as I mentioned earlier. But then it's complicated by the fact that a large proportion of Hindu landlords are willing to rent out to Muslims. That is the contradiction that nobody in the interlocutors could fully understand. They just kept saying it's a power relationship. It is, of course, a power relationship, but it's much more than that kind of boxing people into these categories. But of course, as Mishra has shown, you can then charge extra rent, you can put conditions, you can treat the Muslim tenants differently to any other tenants. So the idea of political idea of Islam and Muslims linked largely to Pakistan at the kind of national level is then translated into anti-Muslim sentiments at the interpersonal levels into housings. And this is linked to the idea of these tropes. Muslims are unhygienic. Now, they live in these kind of deprived settlements, not because they want to live in deprived settlements, but because the state and other features then don't allow that. That is completely erased from that imagination. Then there's this thing that these are close-knit communities that is a threat to Hindus, far from the truth, as there are huge spaces of difference, for instance, between Sunni and Shia in Jamia Nagar. One of the interviewees we had said that in the Sunni custom after prayers, there's a kind of interaction that takes place in the mosque, but in Jamia Nagar it's based on Hindi. But if you happen to be a Muslim from Kerala not speaking fluent Hindi, then you get excluded, although you're a Sunni. Yeah? So there's a kind of more subtle ideas here. There are people from all sorts of backgrounds. Once you go to Kafar Manzil or Jewelry Farm, these are neighborhoods, you will see people driving Mercedes and BMWs. And this is, I think, something interesting which we haven't followed through, but we want to follow, is that well-off Muslims are living in Jamia Nagar as well for fear of violence. But they still have their properties in Hindu predominant areas, and they can move between it. So they live in Jamia Nagar in what is called private luxury. Yeah? They might buy 2 apartments and knock them together to make one large apartment. They have these very fancy cars, but once the cars come out of the road, they're facing all the potholes and the congestion and everything. And they're kind of terming that as gentrification, as ghettoization by proxy, if you want to use that kind of word. And alien cultural practices, dress, food, the whole idea of polygamy and so on and so forth are pushed into it. Rifan, this is yours.
Yeah. So with prejudice, scrutiny, and surveillance, what we've seen that, as I said, the interlocutors were Hindu landlords who were willing to rent to Muslims. So we saw that it was not really an outright rejection of Muslim tenants, but it was very layered and selective. And first look of it, you wouldn't understand. You'd just think that this is how it happens in all places because they look at the background. They look if you're capable of giving the rent, right? But when I spoke with him, and obviously in my own experience as well, they will ask you multiple other things. For example, taking a gap year was not seen as something which was acceptable because gap year also means that you might have been involved in some suspicious activity. So that really disqualifies you as a credible Muslim who can rent or who can be a tenant. So they had their own unspoken filtration process of and that separates what an acceptable Muslim is from the collective stereotype. And it was very difficult to understand how the system itself worked. And so in many cases, you could see that undertone was unmistakably communal in nature. My own conversations with the Hindu landlords was actually very telling in that sense, because while I was seated there, we were speaking, and they were extremely, explicitly homophobic, speaking of how Muslims are untrustworthy, unhygienic, regressive, inherently linked to terrorism, everything. They had no reservations, and they were very open with it. And the moment the azan, the call to prayer goes on, because it was also the month of Ramadan and I was fasting, they extended water to me to break my fast. So there is some suspension of biases that happens on an individual level after we go through that unspoken filtration that happens. But collectively, the Islamophobic nature, or like the understanding of Muslim community collectively, stays very, very intact. And this was even present with the case of my own landlady, which Dr. Kumar also was hinting at. It was that in the process of getting the house, there was nothing beyond the usual economic transactional nature of it. And I stayed in that house for 1.5 years, so I obviously had created a bond with her. We would meet for chai and everything. And so one day I asked her, do the neighbors know that you rent to Muslims? And then she said, no, they don't know. And because in this neighborhood we don't rent to Muslims. And I was like, oh, so how about, like, what if they know? And then she almost immediately, without a second thought, said, then we'll have to let you go. And this letting you go is not an abstract concept for me, because in Bombay, which is also how our on research project came into being, in Bombay, I was not allowed to put my name on the lease because of my Muslim identity, and it would be a problem to the owner if the neighbors found out. No surprises, the neighbors also found out, and I was asked to be evicted in 10 days. So I knew what the landlady was talking about. I knew the influence the neighbors had. And I just didn't know, because in the first case, it was an absentee landlord. So we had no personal relationship. But with this landlady, with my landlady, we did have a personal relationship, but irrespective, it was very disposable. That is what I've understood. And also, while I was vacating the house, I recommended that an acquaintance of mine could stay there, and I suggested his name. And she was like, we can obviously take him in. He was also a Kashmiri Muslim, and she was like, we can obviously take him in, but you'll have to submit your Aadhaar, and you will have to be the guarantee for that person. And this does not happen. Like, it wouldn't have happened, in fact, if I had suggested, say, an upper caste man or woman for that instance. So it's very nuanced as such, and but it's very, how do you point fingers when these are the subtle forms of discrimination that you have to go through? So what this reminds me, and is also, while talking about surveillance, what I'm reminded of is panoptic power that Foucault talks about, because it's a continuous nature of surveillance. I have, for once, monitored, changed my language. I don't say salam, which all of you might know is a salutation that you have. It's a greeting that you have when you pick up the phone. I don't say salam anymore in public spaces. And so have everyone, like the interlocutors I spoke to. Almost everyone has altered their ways of being. And even if no one is watching, we know that there's some sort of permanent state of visibility that we are always in, and that someone is always watching us. And this internalizes some self-disciplining in all of us. And this fear also over time has been really, really normalized. So I feel like the ultimate goal of such a surveillance regime is then achieved, because the Muslim community has learned to, like, self-discipline themselves. And in so many ways, I believe that this criminalizes not just acts, but also the identity and space itself, how we behave in the space when no one is looking, or when we are also hyper visible as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Rifan. I'm looking at time, I think, so I'd like to finish in about 5 minutes, if that's okay. Might have to skip through some of these things, but we have slides here of how people talked about how you stop from saying salam or inshallah to keep that thing locked. My husband told me to remove a locket that I was wearing because that will identify me as the Muslims. The use of drones by the state is very much part of the fear as well. So used during the citizenship amendment protests. The government using drones, every small thing we do is scrutinized, and they say that you can come. So this Aadhaar card is the Indian biometric card, which now is almost every Indian has to have because can't open a bank account within this. So it kind of slowly has moved. And this will not record religion, but you record your name, and from your name, people can tell your religion. So I think this idea of the Aadhaar card is a kind of micro level scrutiny that's. I want to just come to the third part of our presentation, and that is about spatial imaginaries. And this draws from Henri Lefebvre's work on production of space, basically starting with space being socially produced means of social reproduction. So the kind of Muslim social reproduction acts will take place in Jamia Nagar. Representation of space is how space is represented from outside. And these is often states like new capitals and new areas and kind of neo-urbanism and so on. So for very much from outside, from planners, from architects and urban designers. And then you have representational spaces, which is lived space. How do people in these spaces themselves look at the space? So looking at these, the numbers 2 and 3, okay? Now, what is very important to understand that Delhi is kind of unique in its urbanism and urbanization. Just after independence, the Delhi Development Authority was set up. They acquired huge tracts of land, which encompassed villages, which became urban villages, and left a lot of agricultural land on the periphery. And this agricultural land on the periphery was then made into plots and sold. But the sale of the land itself is legal. You can sell that agricultural land, but you can't convert the agricultural land into residential use. It's a bit like the ejido land in Mexico. So you get this kind of unauthorized colonies. And unauthorized colonies are against the cross class, both poor and the middle income groups also live in them. And then slowly the unauthorized becomes regularized, which means that you have to pay a fine and then so on and so forth, but it's still not legal, and then you have to get legalized. So it's a very, very long process that takes sometimes up to a decade. So that then creates this space, and I showed you the pictures of the kind of building that takes place, the haphazard, kind of disobeying all kinds of regulations and so on and so forth, which creates the kind of conditions that are often associated with ghettoized spaces, the idea of poor infrastructure and so on and so forth. Right? And Jamia Nagar itself is not something that has stayed intact. So when it started off in the post-independence, it was a very mixed area. Hindus, Muslims, upper class, lower classes, all that. But slowly over time, it has become predominantly Muslim. So the general outside imaginaries is a mini Pakistan. This moved from Old Delhi, which was the Mughal seat before the colonizers appeared. And this idea that Jamia Nagar is imagined as entirely Muslim, self-contained and somewhat a rightful place for Muslims. This is a rightful place for you to be, a mini Pakistan. Jamia Nagar is unhygienic, unsafe for non-Muslims, but yet go there for food, materially and socially regressive, and an urban other from the space of Delhi, yet sought after for food, Mughal cuisine, and perceived as a close-knit Muslim community, which is far from the truth, because you have working class Muslims, you have the middle class Muslims, and you have the upper class Muslims, all living separate lives in Jamia Nagar. And therefore, this idea of ghetto as a folk concept is how academic discourse and analysis portrays it, whereas the actual lived experience of people, it's very important. It's not for them meeting some academic criteria. They just say, I live in a ghetto because they want to draw attention to how Muslims have been discriminated about. That's very important to keep that in space. Yeah? So one way of Muslims distinguishing the area they live in from simply saying poorly provided. And I want to read this poem by one of our interlocutors, and I think it's very, very telling. And this is about an insider's, this is a Kashmiri student who was massively discriminated in getting housing, and then speaks of this place. Is this the place where I wanted to come? Honestly, this question has made me deaf and dumb. Neither my heart is working nor my mind. Even that serene soul I'm unable to find. A place of disgust is this without any doubt. So disgust is again used by residents. Take me there where I can infuriatingly shout. Ah, this defiled place is intolerable altogether, where my heart becomes fragile like a feather. The infrared traffic is wherever my eyes move. Each sort of pollution exists here every day. Full of overcrowded, jammed and choked roads. Don't know for what are these congested roads. Tarnished the narrow alleys with limitless wires muddled, my windpipe feels grasped and all nerves huddled. My feeble soul will endure everything except longings, a homesickness, longings for parents and siblings. I'm only craving for one thing, that is home. Please take me home, peaceful home. And I think this is really kind of a sentimental but also very real understanding of this place, Jamia Nagar. Okay. So we just want to leave it with these concluding thoughts. And what we're trying to do here is explore the psychosocial, which has not been explored in the literature on mental housing and Muslims in India. The second one is we are bringing in this concept of dispossession and saying that dispossession doesn't have to be only in the material space, it can be in the mental space. And this whole idea around capability, deprivation, functionings, and effect, that whole stigmatization, the whole humiliation, the whole issue of identities come in here. And therefore exclusion of range of rights, including housing. Status, dignity, and understanding why the Muslim appeal to the notion of the ghetto. And finally, there is evidence in Rifan's autoethnography as well as others, a politics of both appeal and refusal. So the appeal is, if you're not visibly Muslim, don't draw attention to the fact that you're Muslim. That's the politics of appeal. The politics of refusal is saying, here's my Aadhaar card. I'm telling you right up front, I'm going to be a Muslim. I am a Muslim. If you deny me, then deny me now. Don't tell me later on that you tried to hide your identity and so on. And this comes from Muhammad Al-Kurt's book on the perfect victim. And he says that the only way a Palestinian can be good is by the prefix of a good Palestinian, loving father, trustful husband. All these kind of prefixes come here. And the only way for a Palestinian to be accepted as a victim is not to be a Palestinian. Right? And here the question becomes, when our respondents talk about hiding their identity, is not becoming visibly Muslim in that sense. And that whole thing is another burden that one has to keep in mind. Okay. And spatial practice, and spatial practice both inside versus outside use come through here. Okay. So,
thank you.
Thank you very much.